we have a fantastic keynote speaker who is the president of A2A Canada and Anishinaabe Mokwate leader, who describes himself as being passionate about building an economy to strengthen his people's future. With over 25 years of experience in the natural resource sector, JP Gladu works with Indigenous communities and organizations, environmental, non-governmental organizations, industry, and governments from across Canada. Now let's hear about his vision for future infrastructure projects. Please help me welcome JP Gladu.
Thank you, Corinne. And supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, a big miigwech to our elder Pearlie for her wise words, her song, and sharing her spirit with us today. And Corinne, those are really some really great questions or next steps coming from your group, and I'm going to touch on some of those today. I've entitled my talk, Park Your Assumptions. The people gathered here today think that you have a difficult, maybe impossible task. I'm here to provide assurance based on years of work with Indigenous communities, organizations, and corporations that there are indeed productive and promising pathways forward. To get there, and I will explain, you have to start by parking your assumptions about Canadian energy production and infrastructure development, the economic priorities of Indigenous communities, engaging with Indigenous governments, and Indigenous attitudes towards resource development. One of Canada's best writers, he happens to be Indigenous, is Thomas King. He often writes about how Indigenous people are usable to the majority population. When newcomers wanted our lands, they described us as lazy and unproductive. When they needed us as soldiers, they commented on our ferocity as warriors. When they wanted to criticize governments, they paint a picture of Indigenous people as poor and marginalized and needing government help. You'd be surprised how little outsiders generally know about Indigenous communities in Canada and how much people think they know about our reality. Indigenous peoples live in a world of stereotypes and your assumptions. When I ask you to park your assumptions, I'm asking you to stop seeing us through the fog of widely held misconceptions and to focus instead on our humanity. Be careful of what others say about us. And here's a surprise that is perfectly reflected in the important and respectful gathering today, is focus instead on speaking to us directly. These old and dated images create assumptions that lead most people to misunderstand Indigenous societies, and even worse, to think that they can actually speak on the behalf of our peoples. My father, I'm extremely proud of him. He was a chief for about 12 years. He took 8 years off. I don't know what possessed him again. No, actually, it was the community asked him to run again as chief, and he was just reelected last month. His story and that of our people is one of extraordinary resilience and determination. The government wiped out our community right off the map. They said that our band was gone. It was in the 50s, actually, that they came in here, forcibly removed my ancestors from the ground. And I'll show you really quickly of the beautiful community that we're redeveloping. And, you know, they basically forcibly removed us. And my grandparents knew, and as my parents, and we stood up. And it took years for our lives to prove that we actually existed. So I'm just getting this back in line here. And that, you know, is a test for your faith in humanity. And we won. We started in our revitalization of our community through business. We have this great sawmill as an example on our reserve. My parents and grandparents worked, and they worked hard. They worked in the natural resource sectors, in the forest, gas pipelines, and mines. Our people stayed together, tied by family and culture, even when we had no place to live with each other. We built a community-owned businesses, as I mentioned, and supported each other's companies. Eventually, we got our reserve back, and you've just seen a little bit of it. And I'm currently one of the very first residents here in the community. Actually, I'm the second resident. Our community is re-emerging before our very eyes, and I hope you celebrate it as much as we do. This is a story of resilience and achievement. It's a story repeated hundreds of times across our country as our people step out from the shadows and retake our place in this country. I want you to look at these stories, almost none of them, which of course make the news, for this country seems like accounts of our misery more than the examples of our success. But there are lessons for your industry in my history in the natural resource sector that I think you're going to find a little less comfortable. Projects have happened on our territories across Canada without anyone speaking to us, let alone asking us for our permission. There is a reason we had to go to the courts to fight for our rights. We dealt with junior company representatives that came to our communities, typically without knowing anything about our people, our history, or our culture. We witnessed the discomfort of company and government officials who wouldn't sit still to listen to the invaluable stories of our elders and were reluctant to even stay overnight in our communities. We were offered ridiculously small amounts of money and other benefits to access our lands and resources. We received promises of jobs, business opportunities, and partnerships that evaporated when the company changed hands or management changed. There are days, lots of them, when being an Indigenous person is absolutely hard. It's incredibly difficult. I wonder at times how our people survived. But there are days, way more of them, when, as an example, I'm out in the land hunting and fishing, when I am at a community dinner, when I'm being taught by my elders, when I'm being extraordinarily proud of being Indigenous. Nothing, however, fills me with as much hope and optimism as the engagement of Indigenous people in business and the natural resource sector. For it is here that they work closely with their land, share our knowledge with other people, they defend our rights and interests, we forge partnerships with new friends, we create opportunities for our community members, we build successful businesses, and bring prosperity and a belief in the future back to our communities. And this is why those assumptions, so common, so widely shared, and so harmful, hurt so much. These assumptions strip us of agency and the right to make decisions for ourselves. They turn us into cardboard, two-dimensional figures lacking depth and substance. Worse, these assumptions turn us into puppets, manipulated by outsiders who try to enlist Indigenous people as visuals in their protests. You can see this working out in real time. Consider the national debate right now that's going on about infrastructure in our Indigenous communities. Based on public commentary, you would think that Indigenous people are uniformly opposed to Trans Mountain, Coastal GasLink, and Keystone pipelines. Media coverage has focused on a small group as an example with Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs who oppose the project, and much, much less on the elected leadership of the community and that supports the project, as well as 20 First Nations along the route to Kitimat that strongly endorsed the Coastal GasLink initiative. How much attention is focused on the fact that Indigenous people are trying to purchase Trans Mountain Pipeline, and that Alberta First Nations wanted to invest more than $1 billion into the Keystone project before it was cancelled. What other people in Canada are consistently presenting in such imbalanced manner, and why are Canadians simply buying it? So let's be clear about two things here. Firstly, some Indigenous people are opposed to resource and infrastructure projects, and that is also true for non-Indigenous communities. Secondly, many and often most Indigenous people support carefully managed and well-explained resource projects that provide adequate returns to local and regional societies. And that statement, my friends, is also true for non-Indigenous peoples. But I invite you further to listen closely to the voices of protest, particularly those that wrap their campaigns with many references to Indigenous well-being and values. Several of my friends, like Calvin Helene, who is proposing the construction of the Eagle Spirit Pipeline, describe what is going on as ecological colonialism, which is like the 19th century Christian evangelism. My other friend, Ellis Ross, former chief councillor of the Haisla Nation, as well as a Liberal MPP within the BC government, called these outside agitators eco-terrorists and clearly resents the manner in which these self-proclaimed activists speak for Indigenous peoples. The pattern is evident. Outsiders come into our communities sharing their values and their worldviews. They find adherents and push them to the forefront of their protests. Sometimes and often they will provide financial resources to support a few Indigenous people to stand at the front as a cover or at a minimum an unfair representation. At the end of the controversy, they leave our communities without taking a long-term interest or concern in the social, cultural, and economic challenges that our communities must address. Our communities know the importance of conservation and stewardship. We are Mother Earth's original caretakers. And that's why I'm also incredibly proud to chair the Boreal Leadership Champions, which is a group of Indigenous and corporate leaders supported by our friends at the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, along with the Guardians, to set in place a new paradigm of balance, achieving Indigenous-led conservation and protection alongside sustainable development and economic reconciliation. You work in the field of nuclear waste, a concept that seems at first glance radioactive in more ways than one. You are tasked with developing an integrated strategy for radioactive waste management, a seemingly unwelcome task that superficially holds little chance of success. The national and provincial efforts has been rattled by the long and thoughtful process with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. Years of consultation and discussions turned down by a vote of 85% against. I sat on the board of directors of Ontario Power Generation from 2015 to 2020. Jeff and Ken, the CEOs when I joined the board, remained committed to the previous CEO's commitment by Tom Mitchell to support the community's decision on the Deep Geological Repository. This was an exceptional commitment. I know it hurts to have the hard work and efforts of the past decade turned back, but I hope that this does not stop the search for Indigenous community partners and a shared conclusion. Moving forward requires that everyone, including Indigenous peoples, learned lessons from this experience and from the broader experience of Indigenous peoples and resource development. It's important that we avoid describing this as an Indigenous issue. It's a development process issue that happened to involve Indigenous people and Indigenous lands. Let me repeat this. It is important that we avoid describing this as an Indigenous issue. It is a development process issue that happened to involve Indigenous peoples, Indigenous lands. Remember the case of the Mississaugas generating station, the natural gas cancellations from the McGuinty era? No one, and I mean no one, commented that the McGuinty government's experience demonstrated that urban Ontarians or non-Indigenous Ontarians would automatically oppose future energy production capacity. But when an Indigenous community raises concern about a project, it is automatically described as representing broad Indigenous opposition to development. This is seriously unjust. There is a huge problem in Canada ascribing anti-development values and behavior to Indigenous communities. This is flawed and demonstrably false. I could sit here for the rest of the day and tell you about countless success stories of Indigenous entrepreneurs and community developing resource projects. Now let me tell you about my recent transition from observer to participant in a process that you have underway. For the past 8 years leading up to the A2A spring, and A2A stands for Alaska to Alberta Railway, this past spring 2020, I had the honor of serving as president and CEO for the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. Over this time, I worked with literally hundreds of Indigenous communities and businesses across the country. I met regularly with Indigenous governments, CEOs, senior managers, major corporations, federal, provincial, and territorial governments officials. I had a front seat row to one of the most positive and empowering Indigenous stories in Canadian history. I marveled at the Renaissance in Indigenous business and the creativity and resilience of Indigenous communities. 30 years ago, a big story about an Indigenous business typically involved the establishment of a construction company or the purchase of a local store or motel. These were and are vital steps for a person, family, or community. But have you noticed what's happening now? Billion-dollar Indigenous deals happening with increasing regularity. Investments of hundreds of millions in residential and recreational properties are commonplace. Resource revenue sharing is regular practice. Billion-dollar impact and benefit agreements happen with increasing regularity. There have been a series of these Indigenous deals in the recent times. Look at what happened in Clearwater and the fisheries in the East Coast. Urban real estate with the Musqueam and Squamish, electricity generating plants in Alberta, proposed pipeline purchases, resource infrastructure such as the Suncor East Tank project with Fort McKay and Mikisew Cree, solar and hydro projects with millions of dollars in contracts to Indigenous firms on the Site C Dam in BC, the Henvey Inlet Wind Farm project near Parry Sound, services companies, particularly in oil and gas and mining sectors. And watch what the Heisler are doing with LNG Canada and the communities along the coastal gas link that support the gas pipeline. How many people know about the scale and scope of which is underway with and by Indigenous peoples? Quite frankly, many of the great commercial dreams in Canada rest with Indigenous peoples. While politicians and commentators focus appropriately on the Supreme Court decisions and the introduction of the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People into Canadian law and practice, our Indigenous communities throughout the country have been getting on with foundational work of building strong, vibrant societies. Indigenous leaders have identified the barriers they face, and I have to tell you, I marvel at their determination. My recent story and my current job provide some insights into Indigenous approaches. At the start of the pandemic, I was en route to Alberta to take up position as the CEO of one of Canada's largest Indigenous service companies, and it was just an incredible dream. The culmination, unfortunately, of the unfolding pandemic and the struggles of the oil and gas sector, my friends Dave and Nicole had to withdraw their offer. And there I was. My condo was packed up. My job was gone. I had just resigned from the OPG board to move out west. Thank goodness I'm great friends with my daughter's mother. We've been separated, we're divorced now for 8 years. And there I was waking up on her couch, unemployed, with a suitcase to my name in a global pandemic. What a story. So anyways, I returned back to my community in Northern Ontario and took stock of my professional future. Almost immediately thereafter, I was approached by my friend Sean Caution, a longtime friend, who had this audacious idea of building a railway from Alberta to Alaska. He asked me to take the lead on the Canadian portion of the project. I was impressed with the boldness of his vision, his commitment to environmental sustainability, and his openness to working with Indigenous peoples. He wanted me to join the enterprise not to implement his vision for working with peoples of the Canadian Northwest, but because he wanted me to do it right. My task, like yours, is formidable. To build a railway from Alberta to Alaska across the traditional territories of 22 First Nations and Métis peoples through environmentally sensitive lands and under intense time pressure by modern capital? My approach, which draws on everything that I was taught by my grandparents and parents, is simple. I assembled a group of experienced leaders from the Canadian Northwest who were known for their effectiveness in cooperating with Indigenous peoples, communities, and governments. We developed an engagement strategy that focused on the co-production, not the imposition, of a consultation plan with each community. I got the full support of the company to cover the cost of consultation and engagement, recognizing the constraints on Indigenous governments in terms of their human and financial capacity, and to do so proactively and not long after long debates. We identified the priorities of the Indigenous communities and connected those to our planning, construction, and operational priorities. These include strong commitments to environmental protection and mitigation, active community engagement in education, training, and employment, and an effort to maximize Indigenous business in the contracting effort. And anybody that knows me that's listening in knows how powerful procurement is and how passionate I am about it, because supply chains offer the opportunity to supply change. And please, if you don't know who the CCAB is, please look up the organization. It's being led by an incredible Indigenous woman, my friend Tabitha Bull. But back to all those things that I'm talking about. I mean, why the heck would we not tap into the thousands of years of local knowledge, traditional knowledge, as well as the empowerment of a local workforce to support our project, which is not only the right thing to do, but we'll also see substantial savings in construction as well as the operations. The cornerstone of the company's approach, reinforced every presentation by Sean and myself, is that A2A Rail will not try to build a railway through Indigenous territories without community permission. And I can tell you, it's been a wonderful reaction when we have conversations with communities to ask them where the best place would be to build a rail line. The reaction by some is simply disbelief, as they're used to having projects already designed the heck out of, and the regulatory process is already long underway, and them often being an afterthought. So with a plan and community backing in place, we've reached out to all of the First Nation and Métis communities. No small challenge in the age of COVID-19. We've done it by letter, telephone, text, Zoom, calls, whenever possible. We've been invited by communities, and we've even had some in-person meetings. Many of the leaders and the Indigenous entrepreneurs are old friends of mine during my time at CCAB, and I share with them all the real love that we share of the land. We have never had trouble finding things to talk about. Working with Sean under this and his inspired leadership, ATA Rail has developed an extraordinary financial approach, and this is really important, that is going to make it possible for First Nation and Métis communities to own a minimum of 49% of this company. This is a $22 billion project. It's incredible that we've got a pool of financial resources available to Indigenous communities. We can't expect them to come up with hundreds of millions of dollars. There's enough financial burden on most of the communities to begin with. The Indigenous communities know that equity ownership brings access to management and the right to assist with planning and oversight, and not to mention the opportunity for multi-generational revenue. At A2A, consultation and engagement is not a barrier or a problem. Instead, it is a way to build a permanent and mutually beneficial partnership with Indigenous communities along the route. We build a better railway and a much better railway company because of these partnerships. The company has made it clear that the success of Indigenous people, businesses, and governments are a precondition of success of our rail. My good friend Chief Charlene Gale from Fort Nelson First Nation, as well as the chair of the First Nations Major Project Coalition, by the way, an amazing organization, also free to First Nations for support, wrote a great piece in the Globe and Mail earlier this month, actually on March 16th, so check it out. And she wrote it with my other friend, Ed Greenspon from the Public Policy Forum. The one excerpt that I'd like to convey from the article, and pretty much addresses the title, is this: the logical conclusion is to work together. All corporate Canada has to do is stop looking upon First Nation as obstacles to overcome, but rather as an opportunity to get things done in just and sustainable ways. Okay, back to A2A's approach that we are living and breathing every day is that development of a major piece of infrastructure or even a successful business is not our end goal. It shouldn't be. At A2A Rail, the success of the railway is tied to the well-being, stability, and achievement of Indigenous communities. In short, A2A Rail takes the status quo as a starting point and not as a ceiling. We can and must work better with Indigenous peoples than in the past, and we will do so. And we will build a railway with Indigenous partners and even better, Indigenous friends. So here in the end are the assumptions that I urge you to park. Park the idea that Indigenous communities support the extreme environmentalist movement and adhere to their vision of the future. There are some Indigenous people who hold these views, but they are comparatively few in numbers. Park the idea that Indigenous peoples are opposed to resource development. Demonstrably not true. Indigenous peoples are opposed to infrastructure development. Demonstrably not true. Indigenous communities are unalterably opposed to uranium mining, nuclear energy, and nuclear waste management. Again, demonstrably not true. Indigenous peoples prefer to take a passive role to resource and infrastructure development and rely on government to protect our interests. Absolutely not true. But here in contrast are some assumptions about Indigenous communities that you can take to the bank. Indigenous communities want and need strong and sustainable economic future. Indigenous communities are cautious about developments on our traditional territories. We are also interested in equity investments in resource projects. Our people expect and deserve to be respected by anyone proposing to do work in our territories. And the future of resource and infrastructure development in Canada rests on the collaboration and partnership with Indigenous communities. So what advice do I have for you to go forward with? Let me give you 6 principles to get started. Start slow. Go forward slowly with the utmost respect for Indigenous peoples. Get to know our history, our culture, and current situation in the communities. These folks will be your lifelong friends. Get to know the community, travel in the territories, spend time with our elders, participate in ceremonies when invited, and ask about community protocols, and then follow them and go fishing. I love fishing. Secondly, listen. Do not arrive with your plans fixed in stone. Listen to local concerns. Ask the communities to outline their concerns and priorities. Do not impose an agenda or a schedule on your partners. And remember that the Creator gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Listen as twice as much as you speak. Thirdly, engage. Good partners require long-term and committed engagement. Issues and opportunities will arise from time to time, just like they do in your marriages or significant others. But the ability to address emerging challenges rests on the level of trust, mutual understanding, and shared interests. And if, as with HA Rail, you want communities to engage, ensure that senior leadership is involved in the discussions with community leadership. Plan. Look to the long term and focus on the shared benefits of extensive collaboration. Instead of these narrow emphasis on a specific project, approach the cooperation with a broad perspective, covering education, training and employment, community programs, subsidiary business development, and other such activities. Fifth, deliver. Indigenous communities have suffered through generations of broken promises. Ensure that you do not add to this list. Promises and contractual commitments are fundamental to the integrity of your company and your relationship with Indigenous peoples, making promises a cornerstone of your corporate culture. And lastly, celebrate. Partnerships are an amazing thing for companies and communities. Completing agreements, finalizing contracts, and finishing projects are all cause for public and joint recognition. Mark milestones with and in the community. If there is a message for you here and for myself in the work at A2A, it is this. You are building a multi-generational partnership on a foundation on broken promises, government intervention, and forced poverty. The most remarkable thing about Indigenous communities in the 2020s is that we remain open to collaboration with businesses, resource development, and major infrastructure projects. We continue to extend our hands in friendship and shared opportunity, despite the often cruel weight of our shared history. It falls to Canadian governments and businesses to create pathways for cooperation and collaboration. To put it simply, take your time, build trust, enjoy the friendships, create partnerships. Get to maybe first. Do not demand agreement in the first instant. Do not be deterred by the first question or rejection. Build understanding and mutual respect. Use the early days to dismantle the walls and to create a platform for future and long-term relationships. Once you're at the maybe, the conversations will change. Then the real work begins, and the prospect emerges for a promising collaboration. Now work towards yes. Learn the dynamics of community politics, but do not intercede in community affairs. Lay the foundation for a long-term partnership, but never think the short-term cash is better than investment in people and in the future. Build a project together, but more importantly, help create a country that is finally fair and just to Indigenous peoples, with shared prosperity and with promising futures. You can get there. We can get there. Never, not for 1 second, underestimate that importance of the work that you are doing to Indigenous and with Indigenous communities, the national economy, and the country. We are all watching and supporting your efforts. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, JP. I love fishing too. Can't wait for the spring. Your words are inspiring and they're definitely energizing. So, and you've echoed a lot of what we have heard over the last 2 days for some of our other panelists, but you've packaged it all neatly into one great list that can serve as a starting point, not just for our work in developing an integrated strategy, but for, I think, a lot of the participants here today. So thank you very much.